Welcome back to the Summa Made Simple podcast. I am Fidel Namisi, and in this episode, we shall be looking at the sixth article in the discussion around fortitude, which poses the question whether endurance is the chief act of fortitude. Now, here's the thing. So the previous one, if you remember correctly, we were looking at whether fortitude is even a virtue to begin with or not. And that was the first article in the discussion around fortitude. Now, I jumped from the first one to the sixth one because when I looked through all the others, for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why these questions are really important. And if there's one thing I've learned in the art of pedagogy, the art of, teaching, is it doesn't make sense to, the first thing, you always have to make sure that the other person on the other side understands why something is important. There have to be stakes involved, otherwise information just does not stick. Now, usually when you're going through school, the stakes are an exam, right? Either you pass or you fail. Your future is going to be determined by that. But once you leave school, and this is not school, there are no exams, there's no passing or failing. So my big challenge is to convince you that this topic is important right from the jump. And when I read these other articles, and I'll just tell you some of the topics which are covered there, whether fortitude is a special virtue, whether that's the second article, whether fortitude is about fear and daring, whether fortitude is only about dangers of death, whether fortitude is properly about dangers of death in battle. I'm sorry, I apologize. I could not see how or why they're important in the life of the average guy on the street. And so I thought about them. I actually gave them some thought. I was like, yeah, okay, I can't. Maybe with time and as I grow in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man, I'll be able to go back and be like, now I see why the question whether fortitude is a special virtue is really important for the man on the street. I hope to get there one day. But moving on, this question of whether endurance is a chief act of fortitude, I realized, this is why this question is important. And one of the things which unlocks why a question is important, especially when reading St. Thomas, is looking at the objections. And now I understand the wisdom of why he begins with listing objections to that question. Number one, he does not want to straw man anyone's argument. You see, he doesn't want to and even worse than strawmanning someone's argument is to act as though objections don't exist. He never does that. So he'll always be like, listen, I acknowledge that objections exist to this particular point of view. And not only will I acknowledge them, I'll mention them, and then I'll go through and rebut them one by one. So the objections to the questions, to this question, whether endurance is the chief act of fortitude, I'll just read them quickly and I'll explain to you what light they shed, at least for me. Objection 1, it seems that endurance is not the chief act of fortitude, for virtue is about the difficult and the good. Now it is more difficult to attack than to endure. Therefore, endurance is not the chief act of fortitude. What this implies is that attack is the chief act of fortitude. Further, objection 2, to be able to act on another seems to argue greater power than not to be changed by another. Now, to attack is to act on another, and to endure is to persevere unchangeably. Since then fortitude denotes perfection of power, it seems that it belongs to fortitude to attack rather than to endure. And the third one, to endure is merely not to fear, whereas to attack denotes a movement contrary to that of fear, since it implies pursuit. Since then fortitude above all withdraws the mind from fear, it seems that it regards attack rather than endurance. So to me, it seems that this question is trying to argue against the point of view that fortitude is mainly about attack and not enduring. Fortitude is more about aggression as opposed to endurance. Now, why should this matter to the man on the street? I think we live in a world where, you see, a synonym for fortitude, it's not exact. No synonym is ever exact. Otherwise, two words wouldn't exist for the same thing, right? But it comes very, very close. I think a good idea that can help us to understand fortitude is courage. A good synonym for fortitude is courage. Now, we live in a world where people associate courage with aggression, fighting, with attacking. So for example, typically people think that, if I'm going to be tough, if I'm going to be manly, if someone, cuts ahead of me in traffic, I'm going to like hoot and, get really angry and try and cut ahead of them instead. Or if someone cuts in the queue at a supermarket, courage means raising your voice and saying, you're being unfair, etc., etc. So that's the kind of world in which we live. And I think that is why this question has relevance to the man on the street, because basically it's saying that, no, courage, fortitude, is not about attack. It's about endurance. That's what this question is asking, whether endurance is a chief act of fortitude, whether endurance is a chief act of, using a synonym, courage. And this flies in the face of the dominant values in the world today. It flies in the face of how we think about fortitude and courage. And why does he explain that courage or fortitude is mainly about endurance and not so much about attack? It's almost, you could say, almost kind of passive and not such an active thing. And what he says is, on the contrary, the philosopher says that certain persons are said to be brave chiefly because they endure affliction. And then he goes on to explain it. Remember, we said every time he says the philosopher, he's speaking about Aristotle. I answer that, as stated above in Article 3, and according to the philosopher, fortitude is more concerned to allay fear, which is, in other words, to turn aside fear, than to moderate daring, than to control that action of courage and aggression and moving forward. It's more about turning aside our fear. And he goes on to explain, for it is more difficult to allay fear than to moderate daring, since the danger, which is the object of daring and fear, tends by its very nature to check daring, but to increase fear. Okay, let's give an example just to explain what he means by this. Let's say, for instance, you're walking down the street, then all of a sudden you see this, big crazy dog, like just charging towards you, and it's just barking and it's snarling and it's growling, and you're like, oh my goodness, this thing's gonna tear me apart, right? So what does the virtue of courage, what shape should it take in that situation? Let's look at it through the lens of these words. It is more difficult to allay fear than to moderate daring. You see, there are two. So you've got two. Fight or flight. Fight or flight. You see this dog coming towards you. You're like, okay, I've got two options here. Either I run, or I pick up a stick and hit this dog across its snout. Right. So the one of them is fear. I run, or I fight, and that's daring. And St. Thomas says it is more difficult to allay fear. It is harder for you to look at your fear and then say, listen, I'm actually not going to turn and run. It is more difficult to do that than to say, I'm not going to hit this dog as hard as I want to hit it across the snout, or I'm not going to hit it at all. I'm just going to stand my ground. In other words, when one feels that urge of daring, of taking action, of being aggressive, of fighting back, it is much, much easier to control that than it is to control the urge to just scream and get the hell out of there and run. That's much harder to do, to control fear. Now, let's carry on then he goes on to say, now to attack belongs to fortitude insofar as the latter moderates daring, whereas to endure follows the repression of fear. Therefore, the principal act of fortitude is endurance, that is, to stand immovable in the midst of dangers rather than to attack them. Now, he seems to make a logical leap here. And to understand this logical leap that he makes, you have to go back to another article where he speaks about virtues actually have to do with the extremes. And that's in Article 4. About fortitude. I'll just quote it really quickly just to give context. He says, moreover, it belongs to the notion of virtue that it should regard something extreme. And the most fearful of all bodily evils is death, since it does away all bodily goods. So he's speaking about something else, but then this sheds light here. Why is it that that allaying fear, which requires a greater effort than moderating daring, is more proper to fortitude? The answer is here. Because it belongs to the notion of virtue that it should regard something extreme. So basically, the bigger thing is always that which is more proper to the virtue. Let's give an example. So for instance, let's look at the virtue of liberality, right? Giving of money and possessions for something good. Do you remember it was towards the end of our Lord's life, he was sitting in the temple, the life of Jesus Christ, and then he sees this woman, he sees people putting in money into like the collection basket or collection box, and then this woman comes along and she puts a really small coin. And then he says, she's put in more than all these other people because she put in the very last thing that she had left to live on. Now, in and of itself, that little, it's called the widow's mite, that little small coin was probably worthless, like worth nothing. But then when you look at it in terms of she did the most extreme thing of everyone else. All the others gave from their surplus. She gave the last that she had. That is virtue. Virtue has to do with the extremes, with like moderating the greater thing. Let me think of another example here on the fly. Okay, let's say for example, the virtue of friendliness or affability. Let's say you go to the supermarket one day, you buy your stuff, and then you're at the checkout counter, and then the person checking you out says, "Oh, good morning, sir. How are you?" Or "Good morning, madam. How are you?" And you're like, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you. And yourself?" Okay, that's friendliness. That's being affable. You could say that's a virtue, right? It is a virtue. But then when you look, let's say now you get to the checkout counter, and the person is like, "What the hell do you want? What are you doing here?" And they're like really, really nasty. They say some really nasty stuff, which I cannot commit to a recorded podcast for the rest of mankind, for the rest of time to hear. Anyway, but say something really nasty. And then you're like, "Oh, good morning to you. I see you're having a very bad day. I hope your day gets really better and that you end up feeling okay. And you know what? Actually, I'm going to go over there and I'll buy you a chocolate just to cheer you up and maybe a few flowers. Okay, have a lovely day. I hope your day gets better." Now, which of those two is virtue? It's the second one. The second one is far more a better example of the virtue of friendliness or affability. Why? Because it's in the extreme. So when we come to this thing of daring versus fear, and which of these two is more proper to courage, because allaying fear is more extreme, requires greater effort than moderating daring, moderating aggression, it is more proper to the virtue of fortitude to allay fear, which is to endure something that is causing us fear, just to stand in its face. That's what he's referring to here. And this is what I would argue the ordinary man on the street, the world today, needs to hear and to understand that fortitude actually looks more passive than active. It looks more like endurance than fighting. It looks more like just sucking it up than dishing it out. And that is the relevance of this particular article on fortitude, on courage, which I think is just, it's at least for me, it's been a bit of a shift in my thinking that courage is more about enduring things which cause us fear rather than going out and fighting against them. So what's another practical application of this? One thing which struck me, because St. Thomas quotes a lot from St. Augustine, is, in the story, in his Confessions of St. Augustine, and this is completely politically incorrect, especially in the world in which we live, but it shows this thing of fortitude and courage being the ability to endure rather than the ability to attack. In his Confessions, St. Augustine tells the story about his mother, St. Monica. Now, St. Monica was married to a man who he cheated on her a number of times, and sometimes, I think, probably openly. That's the sense you get from reading. And this was something which was pretty common in the world in which they lived. I think they were living in Was it Carthage? I'm not sure. Anyway, but the point is, I think in North Africa. Anyway, point is that St. Augustine says in the Confessions that all of St. Monica's friends, the other women in the town in which they lived, would always be surprised because when the women got together, you would see they would have like bumps and bruises from having been beaten up by their husbands. But St. Monica was always without bumps and bruises. And they would ask her, like, what's going on? You know, your husband is such a terrible man. He cheats on you, etc., etc. But you always come in, you don't have bumps and bruises, unlike us. And St. Augustine says that the reason was that St. Monica would never, ever attack her husband. She'd never criticize him. She'd never scold him. She'd never nag him. She'd never give him a hard time. She just bore all of his infidelities quietly. She just endured. And as a result of that, she never got beaten up like the other women in the town. Now, I know this is completely politically incorrect. I'm just telling you what is written in the Confessions of St. Augustine. You can go and read, and that's not a work of fiction. It's not speculative. It's autobiography. He's just describing something which happened at the time in which he lived, and he gives the reasons for why it happened. But to me, that's a shining example of what fortitude is, that, you know, when treated badly, rather than lashing out and fighting and being aggressive and being angry and stuff and, taking revenge in different shapes and forms, it's just enduring. And, the funny thing is the way that story ends is incredible, that right at his deathbed, the husband of St. Monica, the father of St. Augustine, he had a conversion, and that was due to St. Monica and her patience. By the way, patience is one of the sub-virtues of fortitude, which we shall get to eventually in another episode. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening. Stay sharp, stay bright. Summa Made Simple, your guide to light. Catch the next lesson, your journey starts.